chapter 8. So last week, I misspoke. John chapter 8, I told you verse 53 all the way down to verse 11 is missing. And it doesn't make sense because John chapter 7 happens in Galilee and John chapter 8 happens in Jerusalem. And Dutch actually said, yeah, it does. No, it's not. That's not right. And I went, no, it doesn't say that. I found it. It does say that. verse 14, chapter 7, verse 14, he went to the temple, right? Where was the temple? Jerusalem. So he did go back to Jerusalem. That being said, in the context of the conversations, when you put the conversations together, they don't match. So I took the concept of the places didn't match and ran with it, and it wasn't really the places that the places did match, but the conversations did match. Because if you end in John chapter 7, verse 52, he's talking, and then in John chapter 8, verse 12, it says, Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. Well, he never, it's not the same people he's talking to, it's different people, different time. That's what didn't match up, and I was a little turned up in that. So he actually did go back to Jerusalem, just in a different day. Okay, that's what I misspoke when I said that. But anyway, to John chapter 8, I think we ended up finishing verse 4. Now we're in verse 5. The whole thing, John chapter 8, the first 11 verses, everything that is taken out, is a story about a woman caught in adultery, and the Pharisees are bringing the woman caught in adultery to Jesus to ask for judgment. So they say in verse 5, well, let's read it in verse 4 and 3. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and they had set in their midst. And they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in the adultery in very act, right? Now Moses, here's their statement. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. What sayest thou? Okay, now this is a half-truth. The law does not say that she is to be stoned. Well, let me rephrase that. The law does say that she is to be stoned, but it adds to that, right? There's more to it than just if somebody is found in adultery, they're to be stoned. Turn to Leviticus chapter 20. We're going to turn to two places, so keep your hand here. We're going to be in Leviticus chapter 20. Leviticus 20, verse 10. Leviticus 20, verse 10, it says, And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Now, just flip over to the next book, Deuteronomy chapter 22, and you're going to see it a second time. This is normal in the law because Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers are what is commonly called the law. But Deuteronomy is something that is called the second giving of the law. So you'll see a lot of things repeated in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22. If a man be found lying with a woman married to an husband, then shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So shalt thou put away evil from Israel. So that's what they're talking about when they say, well, the law says we are to kill this woman. What do you say, Jesus? Now think about this. The man and the woman are supposed to be put to death in both of those passages. But they didn't bring the man. They just brought the woman. This is a problem. This is a problem for Jesus. And think about this for a second. They are willing to kill this woman at this point. And they would have killed her simply to accuse Jesus Christ. That's the type of people Jesus was dealing with at the time. And that's what was going on, right? They were doing everything they could to trap him. And finally, they brought it to a point where they're willing to kill somebody in order to accuse Jesus, in order to make him look like a fool. Right? This is the hypocrisy displayed because in John chapter 18, they're accusing Jesus Christ to the Romans, and they're saying, kill him, kill him, kill him. And Pilate turns to them and says, I find no fault with this man. Go judge them according to your laws. What did they say? They said it's unlawful for us to kill a man. Do you see the hypocrisy? Now, the whole loophole they were running through was, according to Roman law, the Jews couldn't kill the man. According to their law and their religious law, they were allowed to. So do you see the hypocrisy? It works for them when they want it to work for them, and it doesn't work for them when they don't want it to work for them. Does that make sense? And that's what Christians do today with this. They take this and they said, oh, I like that verse. That's good. I don't have that problem, but I know someone who does. I'm going to use that. And they'll go after him with it. But then when it hits them, oh, well, that's probably not the best interpretation. The Greek translation probably should say this or that. It's not really what he means. Do you see how they do that? That's the same concept. That's the mindset of the Pharisees. That's what the religious scholars and the religious elite of the day was doing. So, and that's what Jesus called poison. That's why Jesus called them a generation of vipers, right? So, they didn't want the people to blame themselves, the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees, for the death of Jesus Christ, because he was accepted by the lay folk, was he not? The normal people, right before you get to John chapter 18, was the triumphal entry, and the common man accepted Jesus Christ. It wasn't the common man who put Jesus Christ up on that cross. It wasn't the common man who took Jesus Christ and tried him by night. Who was that? Who did that? That was the religious leaders, right? You can say the Sadducees did it. You can say the Sanhedrin did it. You can say the Pharisees did it. They all had a hand in it, right? They all had a hand in it, right? So, and they wanted to point at the Romans and say, this is the man that you need to kill. They wanted to point at the Romans and said, you crucified him, right? This is I'm kind of talking about this a little bit because I want you guys to understand this is the religious/political landscape that Jesus was operating in. It's important to understand that, and it's important to know, just like today. Can't the news media news media can take a statement from anybody and make it sound like whatever they want, right? It's the same thing's going on today, right? You can't trust any of the news networks. I don't care if it's Fox News or not. You don't think Fox News skews things their way? 100% they do. Of course they do, right? It's just they happen to fall on our side, the conservative side of the spectrum, more than CNN, MSNBC, any of those, right? So Fox is a trusted news source, but it's really not trustworthy. It depends on what they want, right? So notice how they ask this. They ask, what sayest thou? They want Jesus to pass judgment, right? Here's another piece of hypocrisy. According to them, Jesus didn't have the right to pass judgment. He was just the son of a carpenter. He wasn't who he says he was. He was just another man, and he was a faker, and he was a fraud, and according to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and the scribes and all those other groups, that's who Jesus was. He didn't have any authority to pass judgment. Now notice how they approached him. And when the scribes and the Pharisees are brought unto the woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in midst, they said unto him, this is verse 4, Master. So they're trying to set him up from the first. Master. They approached him as if somebody they respected. He knew better. You know that thing about, flattery will get you nowhere, right? That's what they were doing. They were appealing to him as the common man would, to try to lure him into a sense of self-security, right? And to a sense of a position where he can make a mistake. Again, this is the political landscape he's working in. And they didn't care what the son of a carpenter thought. And that's all they saw Jesus as, was the son of a carpenter. Verse 6, this they said, tempting him that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down with his finger and wrote on the ground as though he heard it not, right? See what they did? They were trying to accuse him. So here's what's going to happen. If he says, go ahead and kill her, they would say, he condemns sinners. He has no grace and no mercy. In Luke chapter 7, verse 34, they accuse him exactly the opposite. They say the Son of Man has come to eat, has come eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a gluttonous man and a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. What were they doing there? They were accusing him of being a common man. They were accusing him of being friends of sinners. Now, they want to be able to accuse him of being a condemner of a sinner, someone who condemns them, right? They're going to try to paint him in that light. But if they say, they want to say, look, he's supposed to be a friend, but he's not, right? He's a hypocrite. That's what they're going to accuse him of. And if he says, be merciful, then what they do is they accuse him of being contradictory towards the law, to what Moses says. And that's what they did. They brought up Moses. Think not, they remember when he says, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. They remember that. They says, I am come not to destroy, but to fulfill. So they would have a cause to kill him if he says that thing. Killer. If he says, be merciful, that is. If he says, killer, they can also accuse him of breaking the law of the land, the Roman law that I mentioned earlier, right? So they have a twofold cause there to kill him, right? So they accuse him, they could accuse him of rebellion. Let's look over at Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22. Look at verse 15, 22:15. And then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. Here, the same thing. They're trying to do the same thing, right? And they sent out to him, to their disciples, with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Okay, see, what are they doing? More flattery. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. Okay, well, look at that, more flattery. You're just and you're fair, regardless of who it is, right? Tell us, therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? So they're asking him here, are you going to subject yourself to Roman law? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt me, hypocrites? Why tempt ye me, hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny, and he said unto them, whose image is this in superscription? And they said unto him, Caesar's. Then saith unto him, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God things which are God's. See what they're trying to do? They're trying to tempt him. Even there, trying to say, well, are you under our law or are you under the Roman law? Who are you for? Are you with us or are you against us? Doesn't matter what he does. They're going to try to accuse him of something, right? So that's what they're doing here. So when they say, what sayest thou? Right? He didn't have the ability, he didn't have the authority, according to them, to judge him. And if he does condemn the woman, then they get to say he broke Roman law. And then they do get to take him to the Romans and be justified in doing so, right? Basically, anything he said, they would try to accuse him. They would try to trap him. That's the whole point of this thing. Let's read verse 7 and 8. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, he that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. So two times now, he stoops down and writes something on the ground. He wrote it something in verse 6, and then in verse 7, so when he continued asking him, he lifted up himself. He stopped what he was doing in verse 7, stopped writing, and then he said something to them. And again, verse 8, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. So what did he write? That's the big question. That's what everybody comes to this verse and it comes here and says, what did Jesus write? The answer is, I don't know. The answer is nobody knows. So anybody who tells you they know for certain is not really being honest. John might not have even exactly know what he wrote, right? So he's just observing this from, a distance or whatever. But there's a couple probabilities, right? I have a couple things here. I have four things. There's four things that I think he probably could have wrote. If my guess is he wrote Leviticus 20, verse 10, and Deuteronomy 22:22, what we just read. That'd be the most logical guess, right? Jesus doesn't always do the things that are most logical, though, does he? Right, when it comes to this. So he could have wrote that. So turn to Jeremiah chapter 17. He could have wrote this one too. Jeremiah chapter 17. There's a lot of things he could have wrote. I'm just giving you 4 possibilities, okay? Jeremiah 17. Look at verse 13. Jeremiah 17:13, he says, O Lord, the hope of Israel, all that forsake thee shall be ashamed, and they that depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the word, the fountain of living waters. Now, didn't Jesus declare to be the fountain of living waters? Didn't he declare to be that already? Didn't he tell them he is the living water already? Okay, they knew that, right? And didn't he write something here on this earth? You know what he probably told them? He probably wrote this verse, and then when he bent down the second time, he wrote, "Depart from me." That's a possibility, right? I mean, I can't say it's what it is, but that fits. That seems like something Jesus would do to me, right? Another thing he may have done is he wrote down and he started writing their names. And then he started writing the sin. And then he started writing the date. And then he started writing the time. And then he went to the next guy, and then he started writing the name. And then he started writing the sin. And then he wrote the date, and then he wrote the time. You see what he's doing here? And he says because in the context it says if you're without sin, there's a rock. Go ahead. And he starts naming names and dates and sins. That would shut him up, wouldn't it? That's a possibility. There's also a story. There's also a story in 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 12. And this one is really intriguing to me. I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. 2 Samuel chapter 12. And maybe this to me is probably my favorite thing that not favorite. I guess if I had to guess, the most logical is Leviticus 20 and 20:10 and Deuteronomy 22:22. But there's this story in 2 Samuel chapter 12 in verse 1, and this is when Nathan came to see David, right? And he tells him a story about a rich man who had a bunch of flocks and a bunch of stuff, right? He had a bunch of animals, he had a bunch of flocks. And this rich man was neighbors with a poor man who had nothing. He had one little lamb, right? Do you guys remember this story? Okay. He had one little lamb. And then a traveler come along, and instead of the rich man taking one of his own lambs, he went over and took the only single lamb that was left in the poor man's flock, and he took it and he killed it, right? And that's what they ate with it. That's what he gave to kill the fatted lamb, so to speak, so that they can feast with this stranger, right? This traveler. And he comes to him. Nathan comes to him with this story, and in verse 5 it says, David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. And that verse 7 is probably what I'm saying he wrote. And Nathan said unto David, Thou art the man. I kind of have a feeling that the first time he spoke, he dropped down and he says, and Nathan said to David, and then he gets up and he says, any one of you, go right ahead. There's a stone. And then he bent down and says, Thou art the man. Now, why do I think that? Because they didn't bring the man. They only brought the woman. It was probably one of them that was caught in the very act. Or it was one of their kids. Or it was somebody that they paid and set up to do this, right? So where's the man? I'm willing, if I was a betting man, and I'm not a betting man, I don't gamble, I don't do any of that stuff, but if I was a betting man, I would be willing to put money that the other culprit was there. Thou art the man. And they start looking at each other and go, how does he know? How does he know? Well, the same way he could have wrote down all their names and the dates and the sins, right? He's the omniscient Lord, right? He knows those things. He could. But that's just an interesting little thing to me. We're never going to know. That's one thing that I'm going to ask the Lord when we get up there. What did you write in the sand to the Sanhedrin down there when the Pharisees and scribes, when they came, what did they give you the woman? I kind of want to know. I hope I'm right. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Whatever he wrote, it worked. Right? Because we know what happens. He said, does the woman die? They didn't kill him. Right? Let's read verse 9. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience. This is another reason why I say thou art the man. Right? Went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even to the last. Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. So they left because judgment was passed. They left because Jesus handled this with wisdom, and they couldn't break through that wisdom. Right? Jesus passed judgment, and he was right, and he was able to do so. He was capable of that. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians 2:15. Why was Jesus capable and able to pass that judgment? 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 15. But he that is spiritual judgeth all things, yet he himself is judged of no man. So he passed a judgment. So, we see something about judgment here. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 15. But he that is spiritual judgeth all things, but yet he himself judgeth no man. If we compare that with Matthew chapter 7, we see two different contrasting things. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 and 2. Judge not, that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured unto you. So on one hand, he tells you to not judge, and then the other verse says, well, you should judge. If you're spiritual in the matter, you should be able to judge in the matter. So which one is it? Both. That's right. It's not the same to judge a deed as it is to judge a person. It's not the same thing. We all make judgments, don't we not? Do we not? We all got up this morning and decided what we were going to wear. That's a judgment. That is an act. That is a deed. It's one thing to judge a deed. It's another thing to judge the person. It's one thing to judge a person for a thing, but it's another thing to judge the person completely and wholly and as their character in a matter. Does that make sense too? You can judge the action of somebody and say, you know what you did what you did there was wrong. You really hurt me when you did that. That's a judgment. And it's wrong, and it was against the Bible, and it was against me, and it was a sin against God. That's okay to pass judgment there, if that's true, if that's really what happened. But it's not okay for you to judge them in condemnation, because that's not your place to do so. Remember when I talked this morning about you need to know your place when it comes to God? It's not for me to judge whether somebody is saved or lost. That's not for me to judge. It's not for me to judge whether or not they're going to heaven or hell. All right, the only thing I can go by is their testimony. But God knows, right? The devil knows. They know, or they can know. They might not, but they can. So it's one thing to judge. We need to understand that. And one more, I want to turn to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, verse 37. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, shall men give unto your bosom. For with the same measure that ye meet withal, it shall be measured unto you again. Just as he's talking about giving, if you give, you're going to receive in kind, right? The law of reaping and sowing. How you judge is how you're going to be judged. The law of reaping and sowing. So you need to be careful when you judge something. We should judge things. We have to judge things. We cannot get away from it. And we should judge things according to the Scripture, according to what God says about it, not about how we feel about it. So there's all sorts of things that us as people don't like, that we say, you know what, I just don't understand this. That's just silly. But God says, that's not silly. That's the way I made it. So it would be wrong for us to judge in those matters. Here's another thing. We are to judge righteous judgment. We are to judge righteous judgment. So if judgment is righteous, it's okay. It really is. If judgment is righteous, it's fine. If you're not righteous in that matter, you got no business judging in that matter. You got problems. You got problems with keeping your body under subjection. You got no business judging somebody else who has a physical keep your body under subjection sin. You got no business doing that. What's it talk about? You got to pull the beam out of your own eye before you pull the splinter out of your neighbor's. If you got that sin, you got no business saying a thing to anybody, because that judgment is going to come back on you. That's what he's trying to say in all those different passages, right? As you give, it will be given back to you, right? So, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. That's John chapter 7. Verse 42, we just went over that a couple weeks ago, right? So, but here's the thing about judgment. You're not to compromise in order to be compassionate. You're not to compromise just so you can seem nice to somebody. So, but you have to try to be compassionate when you're able to. Does that make sense? There's a line. If you have the ability to be compassionate and not compromise on the sin, that's the route to go. But if you don't have that ability to be compassionate without compromising, you're to judge. Righteous judgment. So let me give you an example. So if I talked this morning about talking with a son talking with their father, and how it's supposed to be done with respect, right? And how we're supposed to rebuke not an elder, right? That's where we got into that, right? I can talk to, I think my kids can talk to me and say, Dad, I hated how you did this when I was a kid, right? They've come. I don't agree with this. I've had my kids come to me and say, I don't. And look, I understand. Now they can do that out of respect, and still have that respect, yet still tell me they think it's wrong, and then we could have a conversation about why I did things the way I did things, and how I think it's right, and they just don't understand it yet, right? And we can have that conversation, and I can have compassion onto their viewpoint, and not be, you're just an idiot, and you're just a kid, and you're a punk kid, and you don't know anything yet, right? I could be that way about it, and depending on the situation, I may be right, but that's probably not the best way to go. So I can have compassion, hear them out, and say, well, what does the Bible say about this? And I haven't compromised on the sin, or whatever it is. It's just a matter of how we handle people. Does that make sense? So if we have an opportunity to pass judgment, but we have an opportunity to be compassionate, we don't want to compromise on the sin, but we don't try to be as compassionate as we possibly can. That's what Jesus did here. Jesus did not compromise on her sin. When he's done, he says, go sin no more. He didn't say, go live your life. He says, stop what you're doing. But he was compassionate to her, wasn't he? He saved her life. So they left because he passed judgment, and in verse 10, I think we're to verse 10 now. He says, when Jesus lifted up himself, he saw no one but the woman, and he said unto her, Woman, where is thou thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? I wish they were here to hear this, but they weren't all there, because he cared so little about what they thought that he didn't even notice they were gone. He was just doodling in the sand, still writing the list of names and sins and dates. You see what I'm saying? And then he gets to the last one and he writes them all down, and he looks up and he goes, Where'd they all go? And he says, you're still here? I figured you'd have been gone. Like split the moment the guys ran away. Like that's what a normal person would do. The danger was gone, right? They should run the other direction. But they did. She didn't. She stood there and waited for Jesus. And he looked up and he says, what are you still doing here? Did nobody pick up that stone? I told them there's a rock over there if they want to go ahead and do it. The sarcasm. You know, that's a sense of humor that Jesus had. Right? And I just love how he handled that. He looked up and they were all gone. And I love the rhetorical question, hath no man condemned thee? He knew better. He was just off in his own world, just writing them sins down on the ground, if that's what he did. Again, I don't know. I'm just speculating, kind of reading into the text a little bit. Verse 11, notice she says, no man, Lord. I used another example this morning about the Syrophoenician woman in the sermon who says, truth, Lord. She does the same thing. She says, no man. She says, no one did, Lord. She knew who Jesus was. Judging by what was written on the ground, I perceive as that thou art the prophet, just like the woman at the well, right? It didn't take long for her to realize, if she didn't already know who Jesus was. Remember, Jesus is in his third year of his ministry by now, so he was pretty well known. So she probably knew exactly who he was. But even if she didn't, judging by what happened, she says, this is not just a normal guy, right? But look at the response in verse 11. Look at the response in verse 11. She says, no man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. So they left because judgment was passed. She stayed. And then she says, no man condemned me. And then he tells her, he didn't compromise. He didn't say, go have a nice day. He didn't justify her sin. He didn't say, this and that. He didn't browbeat her with the sin. He says, go ahead, but you need to change your life. That's what he says. Go and sin no more. That's what he was telling her. You need to stop that. That's a problem for you, but you're free to go. Go ahead. I'm not going to condemn you. Right? Why? His time for that judgment hadn't come yet. That was the second time he comes. He's going to judge that. Not the first time. Right? He did call out the sin, and he gave her a commission to go and change her life. So you can still be compassionate and recognize the sin. It's this whole thing about hate the sin and love the sinner. So this is where they get this. They get that from here, where Jesus says, Go thy way and sin no more. He says he loved the sinner, and he told the sin, stop sinning, but I love you, right? Now, I understand how they get that from this passage. But what that has turned into is a new age hodgepodge of garbage that is nonsense that is used to try to justify both the sin and the sinner. That's what they said. Love the sin, hate the sinner. Well, he's just going to be the way he is, so I'm going to love him. What is that? That's the compromise on the sin that I was talking about. You're not supposed to compromise on the sin. You can still love the person and not compromise on the sin. Love the sin, hate the sinner, or love the sinner, hate the sin, right? And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to justify that they're going to live the way that they're going to want to live, and it's okay to still love them. You should love them. You should love them enough to tell them it's sin. See, I don't think that's real love when they compromise on the sin. If you're not, think about that for a second. Let's use this whole transgender thing as an example, right? If a transgender person were to walk in the door, I would not compromise on their sin. I was going to say, look, the Bible's very clear about the sexual impurity, right? And the Bible's very clear that he created man and woman, right? And to conflate that is sinful. It's a contrary to God, right? Now, It would be more hateful for me to just let that person be and justify their feelings contrary to the Scripture than it would be for me to say, here's why that's wrong, and God still loves you, and here's how He can help you with that. It's more hateful for me to just blow them off and not give them the truth than it is for me to declare their sin. Now, they see a declaration of sin as hateful. That's what they see. But that's not the truth. That's not true. I can have a conversation with them. I can show them the Scripture, and I can give them God's viewpoints on the matter. And I can pray for them, and I can, and let them walk right out that door, thinking with a conscience, knowing that I did everything I could to fully persuade them, right, and to show them the saving grace of Jesus Christ. And they're going to walk out of here and going to go, he's a religious bigot who, blah blah. They're going to say it's hate. But it's more hateful for me to try to justify their sin and let them walk out the door and think they're okay. Because they walk out that door, they think they're okay. Whose blood is on my hands? Because I've just justified them and allowed them to do that. It's more dangerous it's more hateful to just blow them off and allow them to think whatever they want to think than it is to actually give them the truth. We should be giving people like that the truth. And that's just one example. It doesn't have to do with just the transgender. It's any sin. It's any sin. So it's more loving to actually point that out. But here's the thing. You got to do it in a loving way, because you can do it in a way that is not very loving and compassionate. Right? Look back at chapter 1, John chapter 1, verse 17 as an example. For the law is given unto Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. So Moses declared the law. Jesus' interpretation of the law is grace and truth. And that's what he did there. This is not a justification of the sin. This is how judgment and grace can coexist together. Justice and grace have a hard time fitting together sometimes, don't they? Because if you're gracious, you're not, or merciful. Mercy and justice also have a hard time. Where do we fit those things in? Because if you're merciful, then you didn't give somebody what they deserved. But if you're just, sometimes you can be uncompassionate and unmerciful. So how do you and ungracious? How do you tie those two together? You do what Jesus did. You don't compromise on the sin, but you still show compassion and love towards them. This is how you do it. And you can declare the law, Moses, and show them grace, Jesus. And that's how you have to talk to some people. He did not come for judgment here the first time. That's not what Jesus Christ came here to do. Jesus Christ didn't come here to judge people for the first time. He came for grace. And the next time he comes, he's going to judge. Right? He says, neither do I condemn thee. Right? Didn't he say that here? Neither do I condemn thee. What, verse 11? Right? Is that what it is? Yep, neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Look at Psalm 82, verse 1. Psalm 82. Psalm chapter 82, verse 1, it says, God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth among the gods. Isn't that what he just did here? He stood among these people who thought themselves to be the religious leaders of the day, that they knew judgment, right? And what did he do? He stood among them. And notice it says gods, lowercase g, not capital G. And he stood among them, and he declared judgment, and he passed it, and he was right. Isn't that what he did right there? That's that Psalm 82 verse 1 in practice is what Jesus did here. Right? Did not God have Moses write the very words of the law? Didn't God have Moses write those things down in Leviticus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 22? Didn't God have Moses write those things down? So why didn't Jesus pass judgment the way they were written? See, this is a warning by Jesus that we need to be careful of our motives and our actions when it comes to these things. Or you can be guilty of a sin that's greater than adultery. Does that make sense? Are we tracking on that? It's kind of quiet in here tonight. Everybody that tired? Because Jesus passed that judgment righteously, even though the law said you deserve to die. Didn't God do the same thing to David for the same sin? Yeah. Yet they'll all say David was a great king. David was a great king. But wait a minute, David committed adultery. God was merciful upon him. Didn't kill him, even though he deserved to die for that sin. Why? Because of the heart. David got on his knees and cried out, Lord, take not thy Holy Spirit from me. He wrote a whole psalm about it, right? So we need to be careful about our motives and our actions in regards to sin. Because, especially when it comes into something like this for judgment, condemnation, we need to be careful about our motives, about how we do things and why we do things, because you can be guilty of a sin that's greater than adultery. And the Bible speaks an awful lot about adultery. Right? Go and sin no more. Right? No, there was no go and serve God. There was no go and observe the law. There was no go and make a sacrifice. You know what he said? Go and sin no more. He said, knock it off. Stop doing that. So that's the omitted passages from 7:53 to 8:11. So all of those omitted passages, some guy named Augustine, he was a church father. Not a very good one, but he was a church father. And he says that in some manuscripts, some were intentionally left out, quote, out of fear that people would use this passage to teach sexual immorality. So what he's saying is that they were intentionally removing these passages because Jesus didn't condemn her for sexual immorality. So they took it out because out of fear of the way it would be taught. See, Jesus didn't care if she was caught in adultery. Go do what you want to do. Jesus ain't going to care. But that's not what Jesus was saying this whole time. He told her, don't do it again, knock it off. This doesn't meet the requirements for the death sentence. Both of you should have been here, right? So, and that's probably true. It's probably true. People would have used that to teach immorality. Remember, you can find a way to justify your sin through the Bible, and God will let you find those things, right? See, people are more interested today in what they say, and how they could run the church, and how they could please the people or not offend the people here. They're more interested in that than they are interested in what the Scripture actually says. That's true today. We see that today, do we not? Right? So I completely believe that Augustine might have been right on this, right? Doesn't excuse why it's gone. It shouldn't be gone. Now, no Bible is going to take that out of the no Bible. You can't find a Bible that has it actually removed. But they all say the oldest and best manuscripts don't have it in there, so it probably shouldn't be in here. But we added it just in case. Well, if you really believe that, why don't you take it out? Remove it. If there's no problem, remove it. But they won't. They won't remove it because they know in their hearts and the conscience, that should be there. The truth can be offensive. If it's controversial, preachers, if it's controversial, preachers often won't talk about it. And that's to protect themselves and to protect the church. What are they doing? They're compromising on the sin. The truth can sometimes be offensive, and while we should not go out of our way to be offensive, we should also not shy away from declaring truth. All right, verse 12. Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world, and he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life, right? This is a reference to his deity, right? 1 John 1:5 says God is light, and in him is no darkness, right? So he's declaring himself, again, to be God. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3 says something else about this. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 3 says, But if our gospel be hid, it is hid in them that are lost, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. Who's the image of God? For we preach not ourselves, but Jesus Christ, the Lord, and ourselves your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, who's that? That's Jesus Christ. Hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That's Jesus. That's what we're talking about there. He's declaring to be that light. This whole world is in darkness. This whole world is without Christ. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody in America who doesn't know the name Jesus Christ. They all know the name, but they're still in darkness because they don't know what it means. They don't know what he's done, and they haven't accepted that. They're in darkness. And he's the light. He's the one who can show them. But we're also told to go give the light of the gospel. We're told to go and give that to those people. Why? Because they're in darkness. They're blinded to these things. Anybody ever been in a real dark room and been in there for a while? And then someone just flips that light switch on? What happens to your eyes? Now, the physiological response is your pupils can't adjust fast enough to the light, right? And in some instances, it'll actually cause pain, right? It'll cause a response for you to, bright light, right? For my daughter's case, right? So when we do that, the light is offensive to us, is it not? Like it offends our senses. But what happens when we adjust to the light? We can see all sorts of things we never saw before. And that's what we're called to do. We're called to show them that light. We're called to shine light in darkness. We're called to walk in our kids' bedrooms and flip on the light switch so they can see the filth that they're living in. Right? Because if they don't turn the switch, look, it's perfectly fine in here. We're supposed to shed that filthiness, show that filthiness in people's lives. And that's what we're called to do. He says, go and sin no more, right? But he says he is the light, and the whole world's in darkness. And so this whole world's in darkness, and all of a sudden some guy comes in and says, I'm the light of the world. He says, I'm the light of the world. All right, we'll hit verse 13 and then we'll call it a day. The Pharisees therefore said unto him, Thou bearest record of thyself. That record is not true. That's just an outright lie, what they said. They knew better. They knew better. What happens is whenever Jesus talks to these people, they know they can't win. They're frustrated by this point. In 1 John 5, not 1 John 5, in John chapter 5, when we went through John chapter 5, Jesus gave a fourfold witness of himself. Do you remember us going through that? How he gave 4 reasons why he says he was who he says he was. The first witness he had was John the Baptist. That's John chapter 1, verse 26 through 29. But he also says it in John 5:33. He says, John the Baptist is my witness. There's another witness that bear record for me. The second witness that he gave, he says, is my works. That's John chapter 5, verse 36. Now, the first 4 of these are going to come in John chapter 5. He says, John chapter 5, verse 36, he says, the things that I do bear record of who I am. Did he not do the miracles How do we forget about that? How did they not just see that? Did he not raise people from the dead? Did he not heal the sick and the lame and the halt? Did he not do all that? Did he not feed 5,000 people and then 4,000 people? Did he not do that? Do they not remember this? Of course they do. This is why that question was, that statement was dishonest. They remembered, and his works bear record of that. His Father also bear record of that. Remember at the baptism of Jesus Christ, he says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." The Father gave a record. And you'll find that in John chapter 5, verse 37. You'll also find it in John chapter 8, verse 18. You'll find that in John chapter 17, the first 5 verses. Oh, no, verse 15, I'm sorry. You see that all through there. And also the Scriptures. That's John chapter 5, verse 39. The Scriptures bear witness to who he says he is. The Scriptures say he is who he is, so he is. You'll see that in Colossians chapter 1. But there's more. Jesus himself bear record. Now, here's the thing. You can discredit one account. If you're declaring something yourself, you can discredit that account. Everybody in jail says they're innocent, right? So you can discredit the one thing. So even if they threw Jesus' account of himself out saying, "I am who I am," even if you threw that out, there's still 9 others. There's still 9 others that I have listed, right? The devils. Do you remember in the devils in Mark chapter 5? They said, have you come to torment us before our time? We know who you are. Please, Lord, don't cast us out. They knew who Jesus Christ was. That's the story of the maniac of Gadara. The disciples testify to who he was. In Matthew chapter 16, it says, "Who do you guys say I am?" Remember what I know some people say that you're Isaiah, some people say you're Jeremiah, some of you say you're Elijah, and he says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter was the one who stepped up and says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Peter, his disciples, declared Jesus as a witness against that. The Jews accepted him in John chapter 19. They accepted him as the Messiah. Right? The Roman soldiers. Turn with me one more spot. Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27. This is after the garden in Matthew chapter 27 and Peter's denial. Look at verse 54. This is Jesus on the cross. And now when the centurion and they that were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, "Truly this was the Son of God." Okay, so the Roman soldiers bear witness to them. What happened 3 days later? The resurrection. Does not the resurrection bear witness that Jesus Christ was God? I mean, that's just 10 of them. That's off the top of my head. There's others. But that's just 10 witnesses. Now, what does the Bible say? Out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall the truth be established? I gave you 10. All right. We'll pick it up in verse 14 next week. Any questions?
Where is he this time? Because in number 9 it says all the guys left and he was standing there alone with a woman in the midst. Now he's talking to a whole bunch of people again. Where is he?
So
he was teaching the crowd.
he was. So he went
He's
to
standing
in
with a woman. The 2 of them are carrying on a conversation with all these people around.
Yeah, so in John chapter 8, he went up to the Mount of Olives, right? Verse 7, verse 53, every man went to his own house. Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives. It says in verse 2, and early in the morning he came again to the temple, right? And people came unto him and sat down and he taught them. Verse 3, and the scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman. So there's a crowd of people around him, And then this group of scribes and Pharisees come and teaches him. So the scribes, the Pharisees leave. The woman's left. He tells the woman to go and sin no more, and then he says unto them, I'm the light of the world. See how that is? That's what he does. Yep. Anything else? You want to pray us out, Dutch?